Imagine absolute primordial darkness. Not the mundane gloom of a windowless room or a basement at night, but a geological eternal night compressed by millions of tons of rock. A darkness that possesses weight and density, that presses on the eyeballs, seeps through the eyelids and forces the brain to desperately conjure phosphine flashes, phantom lights where there is and never has been anything but emptiness. Imagine air so heavy and thick with moisture that it feels like you could drink it. Air saturated with a complex layered bouquet of scents, the sharp mineral freshness of wet limestone, the fungal mustiness of decaying moss, and a faint, nauseatingly sweet aroma of decay, so ancient it seemed to have become part of the very structure of the stone. May 20th, 1945. Somewhere in the bowels of Hill 187, a cursed piece of land on the island of Okinawa. Sergeant Marcus Thorne, a man whose name had long been erased, replaced by his rank, sat with his back pressed against the cold, slimy biofilm of limestone, trying to control his breathing. He breathed slowly, shallowly, conserving not so much air as silence. Each movement of his chest sent cascades of dull pain through his exhausted, emaciated body. Each exhale seemed like a deafening roar in this realm of absolute stillness. On his lap, cold and alien, lay an M2 flamethrower. Its steel body was covered in condensation, as if the metal itself were sweating from fear. There was enough fuel in the tanks for one, maybe two short, furious blasts of flame. It was their last word, their final argument in a protracted dispute with the darkness. Next to him, curled in a fetal position, sat Private First Class Anthony Costello, a kid from Brooklyn whose ceaseless stream of jokes and stories had run dry 5 or maybe 6 days ago. Now he just rocked back and forth monotonously, a pendulum of madness, muttering the names of saints and scraps of prayers, his eyes in the uneven light of their single dying flashlight, looking like 2 black holes burned into the parchment of his skull. A little further away, his back to them, sat Corporal Elias Vance, their radio man without a radio, their scientist without a laboratory. He methodically, with a frightening focus, traced his fingertip along the damp wall, as if reading invisible scriptures known only to him. He had long ceased to be a soldier of the United States Marine Corps. He had become a priest of this subterranean world, an interpreter of its whispers, its drafts, its endless echoes. There were only 4 of them, 4 survivors out of 12. They had been here underground for 9 endless days, 9 days that stretched into one continuous, viscous eternity. They had gone through 9 circles of hell, where the enemy was not so much a Japanese soldier with an Arisaka rifle as the earth itself, the air itself, time itself, which had stopped, coiled up, and begun to rot along with them. They were Marines, the elite, killing machines trained to storm atolls, beaches, and cities. But no instructor at Paris Island had taught them how to fight ghosts in a burial labyrinth. No one had prepared them for the fact that the most terrifying sound in war is not the scream of a dive bomber or the blast of a high-explosive shell, but the steady, maddening drip of a single drop of water falling in the dark. A drip that counts not seconds, but the steps to your own insanity. At that very moment, Sergeant Thorne did not yet know if they were destined to ever see the sun again. He wasn't thinking about rescue. He was only thinking about his next breath. But he knew one thing with absolute soul-chilling clarity. The war they were fighting down here, in the stone womb of Okinawa, would stay with them forever, even if their physical bodies somehow made it to the surface. Their bones might remain here, becoming part of the ancient decay, but their souls were already buried alive, entombed in this cursed darkness. How did they, the best of the best, the flower of the nation, end up at the bottom of this stone sack, balancing on the thin line between life and final madness? How did their simple routine clearing mission turn into a desperate primal struggle for the right to one more gulp of stale dead air in a world where the very act of breathing attracted death? To understand how an elite Marine squad devolved into a primitive tribe that worshipped fire and lived in the heart of a mountain, we must go back 10 days. To that hot, humid day, saturated with the smell of blood and the sweet scent of blooming hibiscus, when their familiar world collapsed forever. May 11th, 1945. The surface. That was a word they would soon forget, a word that would lose all meaning and become an abstract concept like eternity or heaven. But back on May 11th, the surface was everything. It was the merciless, blinding sun that assaulted their eyes after the gloom of the landing craft, making the world blur into watercolor splotches. It was the dense, humid, almost tangible air that clung to their skin like wet fabric, and smelled of a complex mix of tropical flowers, rotting seaweed, the iodine salt of the ocean, and something else, acrid, metallic, burnt. It was the unchanging perfume of war that had followed them from island to island. Sergeant Thorne's squad was resting in the meager shade of a wrecked Japanese Type 95 Hago light tank, its twisted hull resembling the chitinous shell of a giant dead beetle washed ashore. The battle for Okinawa, nicknamed the Typhoon of Steel, had been raging for over a month, and the operation was rapidly becoming the bloodiest and most brutal meat grinder in the history of the Pacific War. The Marines had grown accustomed to this apocalyptic landscape, woven from scorched, shell-pocked earth, deep craters filled with murky rainwater, and the charred stumps of palm trees sticking out of the ground like the broken bones of a prehistoric monster. They were veterans. Their faces were weathered, their souls were calloused, and their gazes were weary, but they were not yet broken. Sergeant Marcus Thorne, a 30-year-old man with a face tanned by the salt winds of Guadalcanal and burned by the sun of Peleliu, methodically cleaned his trusty M1 Garand rifle. Every movement was precise, economical, almost ritualistic. He wasn't just cleaning a weapon. He was performing a rite that helped him maintain order in his soul amidst the universal chaos. He was their rock, their granite core. He rarely raised his voice, but his quiet, raspy word was immutable law. Private Costello, the same restless Tony from Brooklyn, was trying to trade a souvenir Japanese bayonet with a mother-of-pearl handle to a corpsman from the next platoon for a can of preserved peaches. He was constantly talking, his mouth never shutting for a moment, spinning yarns about his adventures in New York, cracking vulgar jokes. This incessant verbal stream was his personal armor against the all-consuming fear. Near him, leaning against the tank's track and completely ignoring the surrounding commotion, sat Corporal Vance. He was engrossed in the tattered paperback, some philosophical treatise that seemed like an artifact from another universe here in the middle of the slaughter. Vance was their radio man, but he looked more like a college student who had accidentally and by some monstrous mistake ended up at war. His main weapon was not so much his rifle as his sharp, analytical mind and phenomenal powers of observation. The other men chuckled at his horn-rimmed glasses and love of reading, but Sergeant Thorne valued him immensely for his cool, clear head in any situation, no matter how critical. And a little way off, watching these men hardened in dozens of battles with a mixture of undisguised admiration and poorly concealed fear, sat Private Daniel Danny Sullivan. He had just turned 19. Okinawa was his baptism by fire, and his wide, still boyishly naive eyes still reflected all the horror of the first beach landing when he had crawled across the sand while mines exploded and men fell all around him. He was their FNG, their living reminder of what they had all once been, scared kids thrown into the gears of war. They talked about home, about the smell of freshly cut grass, about the taste of their mother's apple pie, about the girls whose faded photographs they kept in their breast pockets. Their conversations were desperately simple, earthly. They were the anchors that, with their last strength, held them in the world of the living, preventing them from dissolving completely into the bloody madness. They did not yet know what true absolute darkness was. For them, darkness was simply the absence of the sun, a time for short anxious sleep or a sudden night attack. They couldn't imagine that darkness could be a living, tangible substance, that it could have its own ancient laws and its own silent inhabitants. Their lieutenant, a young man fresh out of West Point with a smooth-shaven, rosy face and eyes burning with enthusiasm, approached them, importantly unfolding a map. "Sergeant, we have a new objective," he said with that ringing confidence in his voice that only belongs to those who have never heard bullets whistle past their heads. "Hill 187. Aerial reconnaissance reports a possible cave system. We believe the Japs are using them as shelters and ammo dumps. Command wants us to clear them out. Simple job, boys. Go in, check it out, get out. A simple job." For long, endless days, those two words would ring in Thorne's ears like the cruelest mockery. He looked up at the hill. From this distance, it didn't look threatening. An ordinary green hill, covered with thick grass and low-growing shrubs, one of hundreds on this pock-marked island. But there was something wrong, something alien about its contours. An old-timer, Private Miller Pops Jenkins, the oldest and most experienced man in the squad at nearly 40, spat a thick wad of chewing tobacco onto the ground. "Bad place, Sergeant," he rasped, squinting. "The locals say it's Fuiri, old tombs. A place where you don't disturb the ancestral spirits." Costello laughed out loud. "Spirits? Come on, Pops. We're United States Marines, not ghost hunters. The only thing that matters is whether these spirits have enough ammo." They began to gather their gear. They took more grenades, extra ammo belts. Two of the strongest men shouldered a heavy M2 flamethrower. the best and most brutal tool for smoking rats out of their holes. They walked toward the base of the hill, the midday sun baking their backs, the humid air clogging their lungs. They were confident in themselves, in their weapons, in their unbreakable brotherhood. They were soldiers of the most powerful army in the world, going to fight a 20th century war. They had no idea that in just a few hours, they would be forced to wage a war from the Stone Age, a war where their rifles, grenades, and even the flamethrower would be almost useless against an enemy that could not be seen. That evening, as they settled down for the night at the very foot of the hill, Danny Sullivan, using a flashlight, wrote a letter to his mother in faraway Iowa. He wrote that he was fine, that he was safe, and that he promised to be careful and would be home soon. He didn't know that this letter would never be sent, and that the muffled thud he would hear in a few hours would not be the sound of an enemy shell hitting the armor of a friendly tank, but the sound of tons of rock and earth sealing the only exit from his own personal tomb. The entrance to the cave was an inconspicuous dark fissure in the rocky base of the hill, almost completely hidden by a thicket of vines and giant ferns whose leaves were damp and cold to the touch. A sepulchral chill and dampness emanated from this black maw, and this cold was so unnatural against the backdrop of the scorching cicada-filled tropical air that it sent shivers down the marine's spines. It was as if they were standing not before the entrance to a cave, but on the threshold of a vast ancient crypt. The lieutenant, still full of youthful enthusiasm and a desire to prove himself, waved his hand decisively. "First platoon, follow me. Lights on! Move quickly, decisively, and quietly." One by one, the Marines reluctantly began to disappear into that black throat. Sergeant Thorne, out of long-standing habit, brought up the rear, and with every step deeper into the mountain, an irrational, sticky anxiety grew in his soul. He could feel the very acoustics of the world changing. With every meter, the sounds of the outside world, the incessant chirping of cicadas, the distant, now familiar cannonade, the muffled shouts of men grew fainter as if absorbed by cotton until they vanished completely. They were replaced by a resonant, oppressive, almost palpable silence, broken only by the shuffling of their army boots on the uneven stone floor and the steady, maddening sound of water dripping from somewhere above. The beams from their helmet-mounted flashlights snatched a narrow, winding corridor from the impenetrable darkness, like the intestine of some monster, with a low, overhanging ceiling. The walls were wet, slippery, covered with a layer of dark green moss and some whitish, frost-like mold. The air was stale, stagnant, smelling of wet earth, rot, and something else, a faint, subtle odor of decay. They covered the first 50, maybe 70 meters, about 164 to 230 feet, without incident. The corridor gradually widened, turning into a small, irregularly shaped chamber from which several even darker tunnels radiated out like the points of a star. And that's where it all began. It wasn't a classic ambush, not the hail of machine gun fire they were used to. It was something more subtle, more deliberate, and therefore even more terrifying. A single dry crack of an Arisaka rifle shot rang out. In the deafening silence of the enclosed space, it sounded like a cannon blast. The lieutenant, walking at the very front, jerked, let out a short, surprised cry, as if he'd stepped on something sharp, and collapsed like a sack of potatoes onto the stone floor. The bullet had entered his temple, leaving him no chance. Before any of them could process what had happened, could react, a small dark object that looked like a pineapple rolled out of one of the darkest side tunnels, a Type 97 grenade. "Get down!" Thorne roared, but his cry was drowned out by the deafening, shattering roar of the explosion. They were thrown to the ground like bowling pins, showered with sharp rock fragments and dust. The air instantly filled with the acrid, suffocating smell of gunpowder. When the agonizing ringing in his ears subsided a little, Thorne struggled to lift his head. 2 Marines near him were dead, their bodies twisted into unnatural positions. Vance, the radio man, lay face down, his radio smashed to pieces, a useless piece of junk. And then panic erupted. Someone, losing his nerve, began firing indiscriminately into the darkness of the tunnels. The bullets ricocheted off the stone walls with a high-pitched whine, striking sparks as they flew over their heads. "Ceasefire! Ceasefire, goddammit!" the sergeant snarled, his voice cracking. The firing reluctantly stopped, and silence fell again. But now it wasn't just silence. It was a living, hostile silence that was listening intently. They could feel it on their skin. The enemy was out there somewhere, in the impenetrable darkness, seeing their every move, while they saw nothing. And at that very moment, a new sound came. A deep, heavy, low-frequency rumble that shook the walls and sent a thick shower of dust from the low ceiling. "What the hell was that?" Costello whispered, his face bone-white in the flashlight beam. Thorne understood first. His heart skipped a beat and plummeted into a bottomless, icy abyss. "The exit!" he rasped, and his own words sounded like a death sentence. They blew the exit. Stumbling, he rushed back down the corridor, the others following, not understanding. After 20 meters, about 65 feet, they ran into a solid wall of huge boulders, earth, and rock debris. The passage was gone. They were trapped, buried alive. The realization of this simple and monstrous fact hit them with the force of a blast wave. This wasn't a wound, not a quick death in battle. This was something infinitely worse. This was a slow, claustrophobic, agonizing death in a stone grave. Danny Sullivan, the youngest of them, lost his mind and began pounding his fists against the rockfall, screaming incoherent curses until his knuckles were a bloody mess. Costello just collapsed to the ground, wrapped his arms around his head, and began to rock back and forth like a madman. Panic was like a virus, spreading through the stale cave air faster than any poison. Thorne looked at his men, at their faces contorted with animal terror, snatched from the gloom by the trembling beams of their flashlights. He saw his squad, his well-oiled combat unit, disintegrating before his eyes, turning into a crowd of terrified, crying children. And in that moment he knew, if they were to survive, he had to become more than just their commander. He had to become their jailer, their dictator, their god. He walked over to the frantic Sullivan, grabbed him hard by the shoulders and shook him roughly. "Enough, Private, get a grip!" Then he spun to face the others. His voice was calm, almost lifeless, but it had a steely edge to it, so strong it seemed you could break a knife on it. "Listen up. The lieutenant's dead. The radio's gone. The exit is sealed. Those are the facts. And here's another undeniable fact. We are United States Marines, and we are getting out of here. Alive. But to do that from this second on, you will do exactly what I say. Without a single question, without hysterics. Is that clear?" No one answered. They just stared at him with empty, expressionless eyes. He was their only landmark in the chaos that had descended. And he had already made the first, most important, and most terrifying decision on which their lives now depended. They would not sit here by the rockfall and wait for a slow death. They would go forward, deeper, into the blackest heart of this damned darkness. The first few hours after the disaster bled into one viscous, cloying, nauseating nightmare. Time lost its usual rhythm. It was no longer divided into minutes and hours, but dissolved into the monotonous, hypnotic drip of water and the ragged, frightened, asthmatic breathing of the 9 surviving men. They returned to the central chamber, that cursed place where pools of blood still darkened the stone floor and the bodies of their comrades lay. Sergeant Thorne, acting like an automaton, gave the first order in his new role as absolute ruler of this subterranean world. He made 2 Marines drag the bodies into one of the narrowest side passages and cover them with ponchos. This was the first ritual of their new underground life, a cruel and necessary ritual of farewell to the outside world and all its laws and traditions. The air, already stale and heavy, was now thick with the sticky, metallic smell of fresh blood and the acrid, sour scent of primal fear. The acute phase of panic subsided, replaced by something worse: apathy, numbness, and a dull animal terror. The Marines sat, leaning listlessly against the cold, damp walls, staring blankly into the space before them. Their gazes were as empty as those of wax figures. Every random rustle, every pebble falling from the ceiling made them flinch convulsively. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere at once. He was in the thick, velvety darkness beyond the meager circle of light from their flashlights. He was in their inflamed, tormented imaginations. Costello was the first to break. The silence and uncertainty were more terrifying to him than any attack.
"We can't just sit here!" he screamed, his voice cracking into a falsetto that hit the cave ceiling and returned as a distorted alien echo. "They'll come and slit our throats one by one like pigs. We have to dig."
"We have to get out of here." He scrambled to his feet and stumbled toward the rockfall, but Thorne, moving with surprising speed, blocked his path. "Stop!" His voice was quiet, but it carried such weight that Costello froze. "Digging is useless. There are dozens of tons of rock there. We'll just waste our strength and break our tools." "Then what?" Costello shrieked, waving his arms. "What do you suggest? We wait here until we die of hunger and thirst?" "No," the sergeant replied in a level voice. "We're going to take an inventory." The word inventory, from the world of accounting reports and warehouse records, sounded so absurd and out of place in this ancient tomb that for a moment everyone fell silent. But that was precisely Thorne's plan. He clung to words and actions from the old world, the world of order and logic, like a drowning man to a straw. trying to impose his own rules on this chaos. He made everyone lay out their supplies. The result of this inventory was depressing. They had one standard issue army canteen of water per man, and most were already half empty. A few cans of corned beef and hardtack, about 2,000 rounds of ammunition for their rifles and machine guns, 6 hand grenades, and the flamethrower, which had enough fuel for 3 or 4 full but short bursts. This might have been enough for a day of fierce fighting on the surface. Down here in complete uncertainty, it was a pitiful, almost symbolic supply for an indefinite period. The realization of this fact crashed down on them like a new, icy wave of despair. Danny Sullivan began to cry again, but this time quietly, silently, the way children cry in their sleep, his shoulders trembling slightly. Pops Jenkins took his small, well-worn, soft-cover Bible from his pocket and began to read the Psalms, his dry lips moving almost inaudibly, but in this mumbling there was a strength that calmed both him and those around him. Thorne knew he had to act immediately, before apathy turned into a complete breakdown. He divided them into groups, one to guard the chamber peering into the darkness of the tunnels, another to rest conserving energy. He established a strict, draconian rationing system. 1 small sip of water every 6 hours, 1 tablespoon of canned meat per person per day. This was his first act of surgical cruelty, and he saw the silent reproach and even hatred in their eyes, but they all obeyed. He was their only authority, their last hope. Then he made the most difficult and riskiest decision. They had to explore this labyrinth. "They're waiting for us to sit here like frightened rats in a trap," he explained to his men, trying to make his voice sound confident. "We're going to do what they don't expect. We're going to them. From now on, we are the hunters, not the prey. We'll find another way out, or we'll find a source of water." It was pure madness. To go into the unknown, into the black maw of a labyrinth where death could be waiting around every corner, in every crevice. But this madness was better than passively awaiting the end. He led the first reconnaissance mission himself. He took Costello with him, so his panic wouldn't infect those left in camp, and Vance, whose composure and observation skills could be their greatest asset. They entered one of the tunnels, one from which there had been no shots. The beams of their flashlights picked out endless, monotonous, dreary walls from the gloom. The silence pressed on their eardrums. The only sound was the crunch of their boots on the fine rock debris. After 50 meters, about 164 feet, they saw something on the wall. They were ancient, half-erased hieroglyphs scratched in ochre, and next to them a fresh inscription apparently made with charcoal. Vance, who had studied a little Japanese in intelligence school, moved closer, shining his flashlight on it. "It says," his voice trembled, losing its usual calm, "Do not wake the sleepers." At that very moment, a sound came from the darkness ahead, a quiet, unpleasant, scraping sound, as if someone or something was dragging something heavy across the stone floor. They instantly froze, raising their rifles and pointing them into the darkness. The scraping grew louder. It was approaching slowly, inexorably. Their hearts pounded so hard it felt like the beat could be heard in Tokyo. Thorne was about to give the order to open fire when his mind, working at its limit, recognized another, more immediate and terrifying threat. He realized they had only a few hours left before their main enemy would not be a Japanese soldier, but simple, agonizing, maddening thirst. The water in their canteens was almost gone. They could breathe maybe for a few more days, but there was almost nothing left to drink. It seemed to be over. But it was then that the quiet, unassuming Corporal Vance, looking not into the frightening darkness but at the wet, glistening wall, spoke the words that were both a salvation and pure madness. "Sergeant, I think I know where to find water. We don't need to look. We need to listen to the stones." Vance's idea was as simple in its concept as it was brilliant under the circumstances. He was no geologist or speleologist, but he was a radio man. A man accustomed to working with sound, with radio waves, with echoes and their distortions, and he was incredibly well read. Somewhere in the depths of his memory, he had dredged up a fragment of information from some popular science book about how, in karstic limestone formations like this one, water carves out a complex network of hidden channels, cracks, and even entire reservoirs over thousands and millions of years. His unexpected weapon in this war was not a knife or a rifle, but his absolute pitch, his analytical mind, and his brilliant memory. "Look," he said, running his finger along the damp, cold wall and showing his comrades the trail glistening in the flashlight beam. "Condensation, it's everywhere, and it's very heavy. That means there's a source of cold nearby. Most likely a large hidden mass of water cooling the rock. But how do we find it in this damned labyrinth?" He didn't wait for an answer. He found a small, heavy stone on the floor, pressed his ear to the wall, and closed his eyes. Then he tapped the wall with the stone. The sound was dull, dead, thick. He walked a few steps further down the corridor and tapped again, and again. He had turned their desperate, hopeless situation into a methodical scientific experiment. Costello looked at him as if he had finally gone insane. "What are you doing, Vance? Playing woodpecker?" "We're about to get killed and you're tapping rocks." But Thorne silenced him with a sharp gesture. For the first time in the last terrible day, a tiny spark of hope flickered in the sergeant's eyes. He saw not madness in Vance's actions, but a system, order, a logic they could pit against the irrational chaos of this place. "Let him continue," he ordered quietly but firmly. Vance, completely immersed in his world of sounds, methodically tapped the walls, moving slowly down one of the widest corridors. He closed his eyes, shutting out the external world, concentrating on the slightest changes in the tonality of the sound, in its reverberation. To the others, it looked like a strange shamanistic ritual. But for Vance, it was painstaking work with an acoustic map that only he could hear and read. After an hour of this agonizing, nerve-wracking work, when their own thirst had become a sharp physical pain, and their tongues were swollen and sticking to the roofs of their mouths, he suddenly stopped. "Here," he whispered, so quietly he was barely heard. "Do you hear it? The sound is completely different. It's more resonant, more voluminous. I'm almost certain there's a void behind this wall." They shone their flashlights on it. The wall in this spot seemed just as monolithic and impregnable as all the others. But when Thorne, obeying some inner instinct, struck it with the butt of his rifle, the sound was indeed different, hollow, vibrating. "Pickaxes," he commanded without hesitation. "We break through here." Two Marines with entrenching tools and small pickaxes they carried immediately began to hammer at the wall. Each blow echoed with a loud, deafening clang throughout the labyrinth, treacherously revealing their exact location. It was a colossal risk. But thirst was a more terrifying and inevitable enemy than any Japanese soldier. They worked at a feverish, frantic pace, taking turns every few minutes, until their hands were covered in blisters and sweat stung their eyes. The stone yielded with incredible difficulty. After half an hour of this exhausting, grueling labor, the pickaxe of one of the Marines finally broke through the wall with a sickening crunch. A stream of cool, clean, fresh air flowed through the small hole. They widened the breach, breaking off pieces of limestone with their bare hands, and one by one, with difficulty, squeezed inside. They found themselves in a large, spacious cavern, a true underground grotto. Giant stalactites, like the fangs of a stone dragon, hung from its high ceiling, which was thickly covered with calcite crystals glittering in the light. And in the very center, in a perfectly round stone bowl, was a small, crystal-clear underground lake, water. With wild cries, they rushed towards it, forgetting discipline, the enemy, everything. They fell to their knees and drank, snorting like horses, choking, plunging their dirty, stubbled faces into the icy, life-giving water. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated, primal happiness. They had won. Not against the Japanese soldiers, no. They had won their first and most important victory over the cave itself, over the stone monster that was trying to slowly devour them. This victory gave them something far greater than just water. It gave them a fragile but desperately needed hope. It proved that they could stand up to this cursed place, that their minds, their knowledge from the other upper world, could be an effective weapon down here. Pops Jenkins, after drinking his fill, scooped up a helmet full of water and like a priest sprinkled the faces of his comrades. "This is a blessing," he said in a breaking voice. "The Lord himself has shown us the way out of the wilderness." They filled all their canteens and rested. For the first time in a long while, they felt not like cornered prey, but as masters of their situation. They had found their oasis in this lifeless subterranean desert, but their euphoria was as short-lived as a match flame. As they were preparing to return to their temporary camp, Danny Sullivan, who had been exploring the grotto with a child's curiosity and a flashlight, quietly called the sergeant. "Sergeant, come here, look at this." On the far wall of the grotto, just above the water level, were drawings. Ancient images of people and strange unseen animals painted in ochre. And among them, fresher, crudely scratched with something sharp, were hieroglyphs. An image of little men descending underground with weapons being devoured by some kind of shadows. And one short phrase which Vance translated with unconcealed horror in his voice. "They do not like the light. They come with the water." Their small, triumphant victory had not gone unnoticed. Their noise, their light, their very presence had attracted the attention of other, more ancient inhabitants of this abyss, those who had been here long before the Japanese, and those who were very, very hungry. The discovery in the grotto, which at first had seemed like divine providence, became a turning point in their consciousness. The rational fear of Japanese soldiers, an understandable and tangible enemy, began to slowly recede into the background. Its place was taken by a new, irrational, primal terror that came from the depths of human memory, from childhood nightmares. The phrase, "they come with the water," lodged in their minds like a red-hot needle. Every drop that now fell from the ceiling seemed like a sinister omen. But the discovery of the water source and the first conscious victory over the hostile environment breathed a new, cold determination into Sergeant Thorne. He finally understood that passively waiting for rescue or death was a certain doom. They had to not just survive. They had to live. Not hide, but act. Not defend, but attack. He gathered the remaining 8 men by the lake, which they had immediately, with grim irony, nicknamed Vance's Oasis. "Listen up," his voice, amplified by the grotto's acoustics, boomed under the arches. "This place is our new home, our fortress, our Pearl Harbor. From here we will begin our war, and we will win it." He transformed their desperate, hopeless situation into a planned military operation. Their small, wounded, demoralized squad became a state within a state, an underground empire built on the ruins of their past surface life, and the first immutable law of this empire was iron, merciless discipline. Thorne established a rigid, almost prison-like daily routine, scheduled by the hour. He divided everyone into 3 shifts. The first, the scouts, under his personal command, would methodically, sector by sector, explore and map the adjacent tunnels. The second, the garrison, would guard the oasis, which had become their base, their citadel around the clock. The third, the reserve, would rest, prepare their meager food, and clean their weapons until they shone. Every 8 hours by his chronometer, the groups rotated. He introduced this system not only for efficiency, but also to prevent them from losing track of time, from dissolving into the eternal darkness, and from going mad. Corporal Vance became their chief cartographer, scientist, and supply minister. Using a single notebook and a pencil stub, he began to draw a detailed map of the labyrinth with pedantic precision. Every turn, every crack in the wall, every chamber was marked on the paper with symbols. It was their desperate attempt to impose an ordered grid of human logic onto the primal, alien chaos of stone. He also monitored the water quality and the strictest distribution of food. Pops Jenkins, with his Bible and worldly wisdom, became their keeper of spirits and moral compass. He devised a simple but brilliant system of navigational signs, small pyramids of stones they left in explored corridors. 1 stone on top meant a dead end. 2 stones meant potential danger. 3 stones meant a safe, fully cleared path. In his off-duty time, he talked to the younger soldiers, told them stories from his long life, and prayed with them. He fought an enemy no less terrifying than the Japanese or hunger, despair. Even the restless Costello found his place in this rigid system. His turbulent, chaotic energy, which had previously erupted in panic and hysterics, was now channeled into a constructive outlet. He became the chief of the garrison, and with unexpected zeal, he oversaw the changing of the guard and the organization of the defenses around the oasis. Their life fell into a harsh but predictable, almost mechanical rhythm. They were no longer just victims trapped in a cage. They became explorers, warriors, colonists of this subterranean world. They created their own microcosm with its own laws, its own hierarchy, and even its own economy, where every bullet and every sip of clean water was the highest currency. They began to give names to the tunnels and chambers to make them less alien. Broadway, Whisper Alley, the Devil's Throat. This gave them a fragile but necessary illusion of control. They began their own separate war. The scouts moved slowly, using a cloverleaf pattern, clearing one sector after another. They regularly encountered the Japanese. These were short, fierce, almost intimate skirmishes in absolute darkness. The enemy was like a ghost. They would appear out of nowhere, from narrow, almost invisible slits in the walls that the Marines nicknamed foxholes, strike with lightning speed, and disappear silently. The Marines learned to fight in a new way. They learned to listen to the silence. They learned to move without making a sound. They learned to trust not their eyes, which were almost useless in this darkness, but their intuition, their instincts. The flamethrower became their trump card, their god of war. One short half-second burst of fire in a narrow tunnel not only incinerated everything living for dozens of meters ahead, but also instantly burned up all the oxygen, forcing the Japanese hiding in side passages to suffocate and retreat. But with each skirmish, with each new day spent underground, they changed. Their skin took on an unhealthy, pale, almost phosphorescent hue. Their eyes adjusted painfully to the gloom. They began to speak in whispers, even when they were completely safe in their oasis. They started to believe in omens. If a strange howling draft was heard in a tunnel, it was a bad sign. If a bat accidentally flew over their heads, it was good luck. They weren't just surviving in hell. They were slowly but surely becoming a part of it. Their small subterranean empire, built on iron discipline and cold reason, gave them stability and a reason to exist. But this very stability also gave rise to a new, internal, most dangerous conflict. Because not everyone was prepared to live by the laws of this new, terrifying alien world. In the darkness of their camp, a mutiny began to brew, and its poisonous seeds were sown by the one who was most afraid. A week passed. 7 days, 168 hours in the eternal, impenetrable night. The system created by Sergeant Thorne's will was working. It was the framework that kept their small society from crumbling into the dust of despair and madness. They had significantly expanded their empire, mapping several hundred meters of tunnels around the oasis on Vance's chart. During one foray, they stumbled upon a small, well-camouflaged stash of Japanese canned goods and rice. It was a true feast for them, an event they celebrated like Christmas. They even learned to catch the pale, blind cave fish that teemed in their underground lake. Pops Jenkins fashioned a sort of trap from wire and a piece of camouflage netting, and every catch was a small victory. But this routine, this monotonous, claustrophobic life underground, where each day was an exact copy of the last, began to press on their psyche with monstrous force. The same eternal gloom, the same persistent smell of dampness and decay, the same oppressive, physically palpable feeling of being buried alive. And the one who suffered most from this was Tony Costello. His feigned Brooklyn bravado had long since dried up like water in a desert, leaving behind only raw, primal animal fear. He followed orders dutifully, stood his watch, but in his once lively and mocking eyes now swam distrust and a dull despair. He began to see shadows in the dark. He constantly felt that the walls were slowly closing in, trying to crush him. He became the living embodiment, the voice of the irrational horror that each of them was desperately trying to suppress within themselves. The conflict started small, with whispers in the corners. Costello began to openly question the sergeant's plan. "We're just walking in circles," he would whisper to other soldiers during guard shifts. "That genius Vance with his map is just leading us on. We're never getting out of here." And the sergeant, he seems to like it here. He's found his perfect war, where he's the king and we're his slaves. He was a skilled demagogue, and his words, laced with the poison of fear, fell on the fertile ground of tormented souls. He said what the others were afraid to even think. What if there really was no other way out? What if they were just delaying their inevitable, agonizing end? What if Thorne had long since gone mad and was leading them not to salvation, but to a collective suicide? The climax came when Costello, his eyes burning with a mad fire, claimed he had found a way to the surface. During a solo foray, he had allegedly discovered a narrow vertical crack in the ceiling of a distant tunnel, from which he thought he could feel a draft of fresh, real air. "This is it, I swear to you," he feverishly insisted to the others, gathering a few doubters around him. "This is our chance. We just need to widen it with pickaxes and climb up to the sun. But Thorne doesn't want us to leave. He wants to keep us here forever." It was open, undisguised mutiny. He offered a simple, understandable, and maddeningly tempting path to salvation. A path that appealed to their desperate, almost physiological desire to see the sky again and feel the wind on their faces. Several men, the youngest and most tired, wavered. The idea of the slow, methodical, mortally dangerous clearing operation proposed by Thorne seemed like pure madness compared to the simple, deceptive, but oh-so-sweet hope. The sergeant realized that a critical breaking point had come. His subterranean empire could collapse from within, consumed by anarchy. He gathered everyone at the entrance to the tunnel leading to Costello's saving crevice. He didn't shout, threaten, or brandish his weapon. He applied his favorite surgical cruelty, but this time it was psychological. He looked at Costello with a long, cold, appraising stare. "Are you sure, Private? Are you absolutely sure that's an exit and not another trap or a dead end?" "I know it. I feel it in my gut," Costello shouted, feeling the support at his back. "All right," Thorne nodded slowly. "Then you'll go first, alone. We'll give you a rope, a flashlight, and a pickaxe. You'll check it out. If it's really an exit to the surface, you'll give us a signal and we'll follow you immediately. But if it's a trap," he trailed off, pausing meaningfully. There was more threat in his silence than in any words. He had given Costello a simple and monstrous choice. Prove he was right. possibly at the cost of his own life, or publicly admit his fear and defeat. It was a brilliant and merciless psychological move. Costello turned pale. It was one thing to be the leader of a rebellion, to give rousing speeches, and quite another to go into the unknown completely alone. He looked into the dark, ominous maw of the tunnel, then at the faces of his comrades, in which he no longer saw support, only cold, expectant curiosity, and he broke. The core of his bravado, eaten away by the acid of fear, crumbled to dust. I can't, he whispered, and that whisper was louder than any shout. He hung his head, his shoulders slumping in defeat. The mutiny was crushed, not by force of arms, but by force of will. Thorne didn't punish or humiliate him. He simply said in his usual level voice, "Take your post, Private." It was worse than any punishment. He had upheld his law, his order. He had proven that his cold, calculated, albeit cruel plan was their only chance of salvation in this insane, irrational world. The group rallied around him again, their faith in him becoming almost religious. But while they were dealing with their internal struggles, while they were waging their small human wars, they failed to notice that their true, silent enemy, who had been patiently watching and waiting all this time, was preparing its final, devastating blow. At the very moment the humiliated Costello returned to his post at the entrance to the oasis, a sound came from the deepest part of the labyrinth. It was not a gunshot or an explosion. It was a long, high-pitched, soul-chilling wail, amplified and multiplied by the endless echo. And then almost immediately, from all the dark tunnels at once, from all sides, hundreds of throats erupted in a furious, deafening cry. Banzai. The attack was total, all-encompassing, and perfectly coordinated. The Japanese, who had previously acted like disembodied ghosts, delivering short, precise, harassing strikes, now emerged from the shadows all at once. They attacked from all sides simultaneously, executing a meticulously thought-out plan. Their goal was simple and diabolically clever, not to annihilate the Marines on the spot in their fortified oasis, but to drive them from their base, deprive them of their only source of water, and herd them like terror-stricken cattle to the slaughter, deep into the labyrinth, into a prepared trap. The cries of Banzai were not just a battle cry. In the enclosed, resonant space of the caves, reflected and multiplied countless times by the stone walls, they became a solid, unbearable cacophony of madness, a powerful psychological weapon that struck their frayed nerves harder than any bullet. The Marines, caught by surprise, opened up a withering but disorganized fire, but the enemy was everywhere. The shadows at the mouths of the tunnels came alive, transforming into short, swift figures with rifles and long, gleaming bayonets. They crawled out of the foxholes in the walls, which turned out to be everywhere. They descended on ropes from cracks in the ceiling, invisible in the darkness. The defense of their oasis, which had seemed so secure and impregnable, crumbled to dust in a matter of minutes. "Fall back!" Thorne yelled, instantly assessing the situation and realizing they were in a perfectly planned trap. "Fall back to Broadway. Everyone with me, move!" They began to retreat, firing back with short bursts, dragging 2 wounded men with them. The rounds in their magazines vanished before their eyes. The flamethrower operator, covering their retreat, unleashed one long, generous blast, turning the narrow corridor leading to the lake into a roaring inferno. This delayed the main body of attackers for a few precious moments, giving them a small lead, but they were being herded, deliberately, coldly, like experienced beaters driving game. The Japanese knew this labyrinth like the back of their hands. They appeared in side passages, cutting off escape routes, blocking off branches, forcing the Americans to move along a single predetermined path. It was a hunt, and the Marines were the prey. They were driven through narrow, suffocating passages, through chambers filled with the human bones of ancient warriors, deeper and deeper into the bowels of the cursed hill. Fear and adrenaline mixed in their blood into a toxic, deadly cocktail. They were no longer thinking. They were acting on pure instinct, transformed into cornered animals, just running and shooting. Finally, the corridor they were retreating down abruptly widened, and they stumbled out into a huge central cavern, the largest they had seen yet, and what they saw there left them in shock. The cavern was lit by dozens of homemade candles and oil lamps, their uneven, flickering light casting giant, dancing, grotesque shadows on the high vaulted walls. This was the main Japanese defensive hub, their underground headquarters, their final refuge. But the soldiers were not alone. Along the walls, huddled in dense, frightened groups, sat dozens of people. Gray-haired old men, women with infants in their arms, children of all ages, Okinawan civilians, whom the Japanese soldiers had either forced here as human shields or who had sought refuge from the American bombings themselves. Their faces were emaciated, sallow, and their wide-open eyes were frozen with animal terror. From the darkness in the center of the chamber, a figure slowly walked towards them. It was a Japanese officer in a clean uniform, a samurai sword in his hand. He was perfectly calm, his face an impenetrable mask. He cast a cold gaze over the 6 surviving Marines, wounded, gasping for breath, covered in soot, with nearly empty magazines in their rifles. "American soldiers," he said in surprisingly good, almost unaccented English. "You have fought well. You are worthy opponents, but your journey is over. This island is the sacred land of our ancestors, and you will die here with us, as befits warriors." He turned sharply to his soldiers and the civilians. "The hour has come to show our indomitable spirit. 100 million souls as one, for the Emperor, Banzai." And all hell broke loose. It was not a battle. It was a chaotic, insane slaughter. Japanese soldiers, many armed only with bayonets and sharpened bamboo spears, charged them with ferocious roars in a final suicidal attack. And the most terrifying part, the civilians, driven to the last degree of desperation by propaganda, hunger, and fear, followed them. Old men and even women with kitchen knives and rocks in their hands. It was a chaos of intertwined bodies, wild screams, sparse gunshots, and the clang of steel in the dim, flickering candlelight. The Marines fired until the last bolt clicked on an empty chamber. Then they fought with rifle butts, knives, hands, teeth. Thorne saw Pops Jenkins fall, pierced by 3 bayonets at once. He saw Costello, the cowardly Costello, with a roar that mixed fury and redemption, charge a group of Japanese, pulling the pin on his last grenade and taking himself and 5 enemies with him to the afterlife. It was the bloody primal climax of their subterranean war. Thorne, casting aside his useless rifle, fought the Japanese officer. Their duel was short and furious, a samurai sword against a Marine's combat knife. The officer was wounded but kept advancing. At that moment, a Japanese soldier raised his rifle to bayonet the sergeant in the back. "Sergeant, look out!" Danny Sullivan cried desperately. The 19-year-old kid, who had been the most afraid, instinctively pushed his commander aside and took the blow meant for him. The bayonet crunched into his chest. Thorne, mad with rage and grief, putting all his strength into one blow, drove his knife into the Japanese officer's throat. The fight ended as suddenly as it had begun. A dead silence fell over the cavern, broken only by the groans of the dying and the crackle of the burning candles. Only 3 survived: Thorne, Vance, and 1 other private, gravely wounded in the stomach. They stood amidst a mountain of dead bodies in pools of blood. They had won, but the price of this victory was terrible. Danny was dying in Thorne's arms. His last words were a barely audible whisper. "Mom, tell her I..." He didn't finish, and it was at that moment, in the dead, deafening silence that followed, that Vance, who was staggering around surveying the cavern, let out a cry. But it was not a cry of horror or grief. It was a cry of astonishment. He had found what they had been searching for so long and so hopelessly. In the farthest, darkest corner of the cave, hidden behind an old bamboo mat, was a narrow, almost imperceptible passage from which a distinct draft of fresh, cool, salty air was flowing. It was an air shaft. It was the way out. The journey to the surface was as agonizing and terrifying as the 10 days spent underground. The air shaft turned out to be a narrow, almost vertical well with rough, sharp walls. They had to abandon all their equipment, keeping only their personal weapons without ammunition and their empty canteens. Thorne and Vance, barely able to stand themselves, took turns carrying the 3rd survivor, Private Harrison, who was unconscious and moaning softly. They crawled in absolute impenetrable darkness by touch, fighting against gravity for every centimeter. Sharp rocks tore their clothes and scratched their skin. Their wounded hands bled, leaving sticky trails on the walls. Time lost its meaning again, turning into an endless torture. It could have been an hour, or it could have been a whole day. Only one thing pushed them forward: the smell. The incredible, intoxicating, divine smell of fresh air, the smell of the sea, the smell of wet grass, the smell of life. They were crawling out of their stone grave towards resurrection. Finally, a faint, barely perceptible light glimmered somewhere far ahead. It slowly grew brighter and brighter until it became a dazzling, unbearable spot for their eyes. The exit of the shaft was camouflaged by a thick, thorny bush. Thorne, pushing aside the branches, was the first to crawl out, and the light hit him with the force of a sledgehammer. After 10 days of near total, absolute darkness, The bright daylight was an unbearable physical pain. It burned his retinas, causing his eyes to water uncontrollably. He collapsed to the ground, covering his face with his hands, his body racked by violent tremors. Air. He breathed deeply, greedily, and his head swam from the excess oxygen like a drunkard's. He could feel the gentle warmth of the sun on his skin. He was alive. He was on the surface. Vance emerged next, pulling Harrison out with his last ounce of strength. The three of them lay on the grass, unable to believe their salvation. The world around them seemed unreal, painted, too bright, too loud. They heard the singing of unfamiliar birds, the soothing sound of the surf, the distant business-like hum of engines. These were the sounds of paradise after the hell of silence and sinister echoes. Their euphoria was short-lived. A few minutes later, a passing Marine patrol found them lying in a semi-conscious state. The sight of the three was horrifying. They were covered in a thick layer of mud, caked blood, and black soot. Their uniforms were reduced to stinking rags. A heavy, sweetish smell of death and damp earth emanated from them, and their eyes. In them was a bottomless emptiness that only those who have stared into the abyss themselves could understand. "Friendly," Thorne croaked, struggling to raise his hands. "We're friendly. Charlie Company." The rescue they had so desperately awaited, had prayed for, turned into a new, sophisticated form of torture. They were immediately sent to a rear area hospital. Private Harrison died on the way, never regaining consciousness from his wounds. And Thorne and Vance, as soon as they recovered a little, faced endless interrogations. Their stories sounded like the incoherent ravings of madmen. 10 days underground? A huge underground complex that wasn't on any intelligence maps. A massacre in a central cavern involving hundreds of Japanese soldiers and civilians. The officers from division headquarters listened to them with polite but unconcealed disbelief. Their account didn't fit into the neat, logical framework of military reports and dispatches. Where were the other 9 men? Dead. Where are their bodies? Down there. Where's the proof? There is no proof. Their words were the only evidence. "Sergeant," one of the captains from the intelligence department told him, looking into his eyes with concern. "We understand perfectly well that you and your comrade have experienced a severe psychological trauma. Combat shock, shell shock. It's possible you imagined all of this in a state of delirium. Imagined it. 10 days of hell, the deaths of 9 comrades, Danny Sullivan's blood on his hands, all just imagined. In that moment, Thorne realized they had escaped one stone prison only to immediately fall into another. A prison of disbelief, bureaucracy, and oblivion. Their feat, their incredible story of survival was too inconvenient, too irrational, too terrifying. It violated the entire logic of modern warfare. It was much simpler and more convenient to write everything off as the post-traumatic stress disorder of 2 survivors. They did send a team of engineers to Hill 187. They confirmed that the main entrance to the caves was indeed sealed by a massive explosion, after which, on command, they blew it up again to seal it completely. No one bothered to look for the small air shaft from which Thorne and Vance had emerged. No one went down into the central cavern to count the bodies and confirm their story. The official report stated that Sergeant Thorne's squad had been ambushed at the entrance to a cave complex and was completely annihilated in a short engagement. The 2 miraculous survivors, Sergeant Thorne and Corporal Vance, were suffering from severe combat stress and were unable to provide a coherent, consistent account of the events. Their war was buried under a classified stamp. Their feat was erased from history like a poorly written line. No one conducted the investigation that could have proven them right. Instead of medals and glory, they received orders for a medical discharge and a humiliating non-disclosure agreement. Their brotherhood, forged in the fiery heart of the mountain, was destroyed by the stroke of a pen from a soulless staff clerk. Their underground war remained their personal, relentless nightmare, which they were forbidden to tell anyone about. The fate of the 2 survivors was as tragic and unnoticed as that of their fallen comrades. They returned to the world they had bled for, but this world, with its terrible, inconvenient truth, had no need for them. Sergeant Marcus Thorne was sent home to a quiet, sleepy town in Ohio. He was awarded the Purple Heart for his wounds, but his service record contained not a single word about the 10 days spent underground. He tried with all his might to live a normal, peaceful life. He got a job at the local cannery. He even tried to start a family, got married, but the marriage fell apart after a year. The cave wouldn't let him go. He couldn't sleep in dark rooms. He needed a nightlight, like a small child. He was tormented by monstrous nightmares in which he relived the final, bloody battle in the cavern over and over again. He saw Danny Sullivan's face, contorted in pain, heard Costello's dying scream. He started to drink, quietly, alone, without making trouble. He slowly walled himself off from the world with an invisible barrier, becoming sullen and silent. His neighbors considered him strange, unsociable, just another war hero who had never really come back from it. None of them ever suspected that he hadn't come back from a war, but from the grave. He died in 1968 from cirrhosis of the liver, completely alone. He was buried with full military honors, but his simple headstone said nothing of his greatest, most terrible battle. Corporal Elias Vance chose a different path. He didn't try to forget. He desperately tried to understand and to prove. He went to university, earned a doctorate, and became a professor of geology and anthropology. He dedicated his entire life to the study of karstic caves and ancient burial cultures. Again and again in his thoughts and on expeditions, he returned to Okinawa. Using his phenomenal memory, he drew an incredibly detailed map of that very underground labyrinth. He wrote several brilliant academic papers in which, forbidden to mention the war, he proposed bold theories about the existence of complex multi-level catacomb systems under the Okinawan hills. His colleagues in the academic world considered him a brilliant but slightly mad, eccentric scientist. His obsession with Okinawa was called a professorial quirk. He never married, never had children. He spent his entire life in a desperate but futile attempt to prove to himself and to the world that what had happened to him was real. He died of a massive heart attack in 1985, right at his desk in his university office. Lying on the desk before him was the unfinished, heavily annotated map of Hill 187. Even less was known about the fates of the other members of the squad. Their names were carved on the white marble plaques of memorial boards as soldiers who had died heroically in battle on the island of Okinawa. Their families received standard government-issued death notifications with no details. They had simply vanished, swallowed by war and the earth. The world they had saved at the cost of their lives and their souls did not preserve even a speck of memory about them. Their feat was too great, too terrifying, and too inconvenient for the official, polished version of history. They had won their small personal underground war, but suffered a crushing defeat in their clash with the larger world, which demanded simple poster boy heroes and clear, unambiguous victories. Their story became a secret, locked away in the tortured minds of two survivors. But as the local Okinawans told it, on Sergeant Thorne's grave in distant, almost mythical America, every year in May, on the anniversary of those events, someone unknown would leave a handful of pure white coral sand and a small, smooth sea stone. Who brought them and how, no one knew. The official history of the Battle of Okinawa is a dry, emotionless chronicle of numbers and facts. Division numbers, amounts of ammunition used, casualty statistics, the heights of hills taken by storm. In this grand but soulless history, there is no place for Sergeant Thorne's small, lost squad. In the dry, dust-covered staff reports stored in archives, their mission is listed as a failed reconnaissance in force, which resulted in the loss of an entire Marine squad. 2 survivors, discharged due to severe post-traumatic stress syndrome. Period. The history written by the victors does not tolerate dark spots and unexplained shadows, and their war was woven entirely from them, but what paper erases, human memory passed down by word of mouth preserves forever. The story of the ghost squad of Hill 187 did not disappear without a trace. It entered folklore. It transformed, became embellished with fictional details, and turned into a soldier's legend that veterans of the Pacific Campaign would tell in whispers in dimly lit bars, decades after the war ended. They said there was a squad of Marines on Okinawa that went underground in search of the Japanese and vanished without a trace. That they didn't die but remained down there, cursed by the place, to eternally wage their endless war against the spirits of the ancient warriors they had disturbed. Among the American soldiers stationed at military bases on Okinawa after the war, in the 60s and 70s, there was a persistent belief that one should not approach Hill 187 at night. They said that sometimes, if you pressed your ear to the ground, you could hear muffled screams in English and Japanese, and the distant clang of metal coming from below. This tragic story turned into a dark myth about how war doesn't really end with the signing of a surrender. That there are places on Earth where it freezes, like in amber, and continues to last forever, invisible to the rest of the world. The story of Sergeant Thorne's squad is not just a chronicle of survival in extreme conditions. It is a brutal reminder that the most terrifying and most important battles in human history have not taken place on broad battlefields, but in tight, enclosed spaces, in the souls of individuals, in the steel coffins of submarines, in bombed-out shelters, and in the dark, damp, silent caves beneath nameless hills. It is a story of how a modern, technologically advanced, heavily armed man finds himself utterly helpless and vulnerable in the face of primal, irrational, prehistoric horror. And that the only weapon against such all-consuming horror is not steel or gunpowder, but indomitable human will, a sharp intellect, and the very humanity that desperately refuses to die, even in conditions of absolute, hopeless darkness. Their feat was consigned to oblivion, their names erased from the annals of history, but their story lives on. It lives on as a legend, as a quiet whisper in the dark, reminding us that every great official war has its own invisible, secret, subterranean dimension that will never be written about in textbooks. And as long as we remember stories like these, no soldier, not even the most unknown, will ever be truly forgotten.